Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Strengthening Trust in Public-Private Data Exchanges, a perhaps somewhat boring title for a subject that is actually incredibly interesting, and a subject that I think is going to get more relevant as we look ahead. Public-private data exchanges for the common good have created more than $20 billion in new revenue with innovative business models. But I think there's another way to talk about this. And I've been trying to think of an English saying. I've been trying to think of it for days, and I can't think of the aphorism, but it describes that sometimes being safe, trying to protect yourself from danger, actually puts you in more danger. And hopefully, through this panel, we'll be able to bring out that idea when it comes to data, that if we don't look ahead and maybe change some of our accepted wisdom when it comes to data, we may find that we put ourselves at more risk than we knew. And haven't we learned in the past few years that the unexpected risk is a risk as well? Let me introduce you to my panel. Sitting next to me is Lauren Woodman, the Executive Director of DataKind. Sitting next to Lauren is Fabrice Tocco, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Dorwex in France. Angela Lungati is the Executive Director of Ushahidi. Is that the right pronunciation? Ushahidi, I'm sorry. That's not the only thing I'm going to get wrong while we spend the next 30 minutes with each other. And Hind Eriksson is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Aker ASA Norway. Correct me, I'm wrong on that too, aren't I?
It's good enough.
Okay, all right. So actually, it's very likely that I know, well, it's certainly the case that I know less about this subject than anyone sitting on this panel, and very likely that I know less about this than some of the folks sitting here or watching. But that may be a good thing, because many all of the people sitting on this panel have found themselves in the boardroom with a CEO or in a meeting with a government minister who also doesn't know very much about the issues and has to persuade, has to convince that person that private public data exchange is a good idea. Lauren, that you've been making that case for many years. Make that case for us now.
Well, thank you for posing the question, because it is one of those areas where I think many of us have seen enormous promise, but really are still struggling with how to make that promise come to fruition. And when we look at it in terms of the global goals, and the things that we want to get accomplished by 2030, I think there are a handful of areas where we can really concentrate so we can see some faster progress. One, look, data lets us understand what's really happening, and so sometimes what we think is happening around the world actually is quite different than what the data tells us. And it's important to have those insights. Two, it helps us measure whether or not we're making any progress. Just because something feels like we're making progress doesn't mean that we are actually making progress. And when we're dealing with such critical issues, we want to know that we are in fact making progress. And then finally, and I think perhaps most importantly, data allows us, especially when we share data, allows us to empower communities around the world to have a voice in the solutions that will affect them. And it really gives us a way for people to understand their own context, for people to develop solutions that are locally relevant, and for us to make progress in ways that are relevant to the communities that will be affected.
And we're talking about public-private data exchanges, and the reason why that's the issue is because in most cases, I guess in all cases, somebody or an organization owns the data and somebody else could benefit from it.
Absolutely. There is certainly a wide variety of public data that are out there, and that public data is incredibly useful in helping to understand what's happening and to drive insights. But private companies have enormous amounts of data that could be particularly applicable to some of the unique scenarios that we're talking about. When we think about climate change, what shipping companies know about emissions, what oil and gas company knows about the differences in the application of different technologies. All of those are things that would help us solve some problems.
Okay. Arvind, you have a wide range of, in your portfolio, if you like. And you've been thinking a lot about how data can be useful looking ahead. Give us that context. What could we be talking about that could change lives, possibly even change the world?
Sure. So in Aker, we have a portfolio of industrial activities, including renewable energy, clean technology like carbon capture and oil and gas, and a number of other industrial businesses. And what we experience as all other leaders today is that the challenges are so large, so it's impossible for an individual company or an individual government to resolve it by themselves. So it's a strong self-interest also from business leaders to start opening up and sharing information. Let me offer you one very specific and important example. As we speak, there's an energy crisis going on, not only in Europe but in other parts of the world. And a part of the solution is to scale renewable energy, offshore wind in particular, more rapidly and aggressively than what we were planning for only a few months ago. Based on current estimates, offshore wind is expected to grow 40 times from current capacity in the next 2 to 3 decades. Keep that in mind when you also take into account the fact that the permit processes will typically take between 7 and 10 years. And the permit processes today are run by individual companies and individual governments. If we open up and start sharing data, which are not business critical, but we all need, for instance, to do the environmental assessment properly. And maybe share the data to the extent that the regulators can do a significant part of the assessments themselves. We could reduce the time it takes to run the regulatory processes significantly and help scaling and fast-tracking the change to a more sustainable energy system.
And Angela, I'm going to look down and read here because it's quite a story. You were one of the earliest open source platforms which has grown from using mobile phones in the 2008 Kenyan elections to a global platform serving 160 countries. So what has been the benefit? Why has that changed people's lives?
I think the key thing there lies in what our goal as Ushahidi actually is. And it speaks to the point that Lauren was mentioning about empowering ordinary communities. We want to make sure that marginalized and underrepresented groups are able to raise their voices and raise their voices on critical issues that directly affect them and have those voices influence the decisions that are being made about them and effectively create the change that they want to see. So it's really about creating this bottom-up approach, having information being generated from people who are directly affected, really tapping into the collective intelligence of the crowd, because that ordinary person will have a better understanding about their cultural context, how this particular issue directly affects them. And when I think about how that's played out for us in the different use cases, so, looking at the humanitarian and natural disaster space, looking at it as a means of directly engaging with somebody who's affected by a crisis in a way that allows you to really understand what the need is and influence what support you're going to be able to give them. In the context of human rights protection, being able to surface a lot of what's going on, but then also make use of that data to move the conversation away from just creating awareness into what do we need to do to change the situation, right? And in the good governance space, think election monitoring or corruption mapping, using that citizen-generated information to hold duty bearers to account and uphold the integrity of democracies around the world.
Okay, so just to put it in simple terms for me so I can understand, yes. You're using mobile phone data in order to get a picture of people's behavior, or are they responding to questions, or how are you generating that data, and then how are you using it in simple terms?
Look at it in terms of using the mobile phone as a way of being able to collect data from this ordinary person who'll be able to share their opinion about a particular issue. They'll be able to report something that is happening around them, and have that get aggregated and put in a place where you can collectively get to see what many other people are getting to see.
So people are answering questions. So in
Yes.
that case, in that very simple case, people know they're answering questions, they know they're providing the data, and then that data is being used.
Absolutely.
I want to move on to you, Fabrice, because that's just bringing us on to one of the obviously elephant in the room of this whole debate, which is about trust. And that's something that you're on the cutting edge of. How do you build trust so that data can be shared between private and public enterprise? Talk about make that case, if you like.
Trust is key in any business, in any kind of economy, and especially in the data, because we are talking here about benefits, but for many years people only see a risk with data sharing. And the key component of data sharing is really the trust in the data transaction. So following what we have seen, the three key components of the data transaction is the regulation itself. So you can see worldwide many regulations that are on the coming: GDPR, Data Governance Act, Data Act, regulation in California, in Korea, in Japan. So regulation will bring trust. The technology will bring trust, because when you do a data transaction, you need to trust the data user. The data user needs to trust the data provider. The data provider needs to be sure that he will stay in control with the data that he will have shared. He has to be sure that he will have the traceability of the data. So that's the technical aspect of the data transaction itself.
So whichever organization owns the data needs to know that they still own the data. They haven't lost control of it.
Yeah, and the last point is the maturity of the stakeholder. What is your strategy? Do you know what you are doing? Do you know what data you want to share with whom, for what kind of benefits? When you feel confident in data sharing, then you start the trust and you start the virtuous loop.
So I fully agree, but the question is also trust with whom? And we tend to discuss data sharing as if it was about sharing data with the public domain all the time. But it's also about sharing data with relevant public or private stakeholders, like governments or like competitors and colleagues in the same industry. So if you ask yourself, with whom should I share the data in order to resolve a specific challenge or issue, it becomes a more practical and hopefully in a slightly more easy discussion.
And what questions should you ask yourself about that whom or that government when you're considering whether to share with them?
Well, in reality, it often starts with your self-interest. And sometimes it's to facilitate science, other times it's to fast-track a regulatory process, but it could also be to develop technology, which can help the business and the world forward. So if you start with your own business, your self-interest, you will have at least a part of the answer.
Fabrice, just to finish off our conversation, because I wanted to make sure people understood, not sure everyone does understand, that actually there are very different kinds of data. And in fact, you don't necessarily have to hand over the data, you can hand over your understanding of the data. You put it in better terms than I can.
Talking about data, it could be raw data, it could be aggregated data. So you choose what level of data you are ready to share. And coming back to the benefits and the reward, of course, corporates, they want a reward on the data sharing. So there are many indirect and direct benefits to share data. Direct benefits, it's like when you share data with your supplier, you have the chance to have better products or better services. When you share data with the large community, you have an indirect benefit, which is huge. It's a brand awareness, brand visibility, brand credibility. It's also a matter of transparency. You show transparency to the market.
But if I'm a CEO, and anyone can answer this question, if I'm a CEO, I'm hearing you and I'm thinking, oh yeah, I can see there are some great brand benefits. I can also see there are some huge brand risks if this data ends up doing something that actually damages the trust of my consumers, which is the most important thing in my world.
Yeah, you don't do innovative business when you are too far away from the red line. You do innovative business when you come close to the red line, you don't cross the red line, you see what is the regulations, what is your strategy, you clearly understand where you want to go, and then you do innovation. That's a question of innovation.
So you have to really understand it. Let me just, Lauren, we're trying to put this in simple terms, but already it's clear that actually it's complex. And for anyone watching who's trying to figure out how this works in their world, actually, it's kind of bespoke for everybody. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. And I think there are trends that you see. But I do think that, you know, Orvin, I think your point was a very good one, which is when we start to talk about data sharing, you have to understand why it is that you're sharing data, what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And then there is the question of, okay, does this data actually help me move that forward? And are the individuals or organizations with whom I am sharing, do we share that interest in moving something forward? You know, it is one thing to share information and share data or make data publicly available about your own internal operations or the way that you're doing work. If you and I needed to cooperate on something, I might share a different level of data with you because you might need a deeper insight for us to be able to, you know, actually do something jointly. And we may need to do that because it is far more efficient for you to do what you're good at, me to do what I'm good at, but we need to be working from the same set of facts or a shared set of facts. And so I think, you know, maybe it's not bespoke for everyone, but there are certainly, I think, it is very hard to generalize, and too often our conversations around data sharing are general, and we try and apply, you know, very general rules to very unique situations, and that doesn't help us engender trust.
Right, okay, so the message from this panel is, actually, you need to go away and do your research and figure it out for yourself. Evin, you wanted to jump in.
So we're discussing trust, and trust is fundamental also for business leaders and companies. In this particular respect, the dialogue here in Davos has changed fundamentally in recent years.
Yeah.
Only a few years ago, the discussion was about how to protect and hide your data. For instance, about emissions, because we were afraid about litigation. Today, we all acknowledge that we need to share data, also about sensitive issues like emission from our operations, in order to build trust with regulators, with business partners, with employees, and with other stakeholders. So there's a fundamental shift in mindset from not sharing to how much can I share, and then we can discuss about the limitation for legal reasons or other limiting factors.
Angela, 160 countries, your platform, so that there has to be trust issues.
Absolutely, and one of the points that I wanted to make when Oyvind and Lauren were speaking was you also have to think about the context within which you're sharing that data, right? So, for example, in crisis situations, it's critical for us to be able to share possibly personal identifying information because you need to be able to track where somebody is. But after the crisis is done, does it make sense to share that personal identifying information anymore? And so in our case, we've had to be really intentional about clearly communicating why this data needs to be collected, what is going to be done with it, and what will be done after the event. Just managing the expectations from the perspective of that ordinary person who's sending us a text message, who might also have concerns about, will this come back to bite me later because I shared this information?
Yeah, I mean, just opening it up to anyone who wants to answer. I guess if I was a member of a government or a company leader watching this, listening to the complexity, worrying about reputational risk, all of those things that we've discussed, I might be thinking right now, this just seems too hard. So can we get back to the advantages? Why do I, not just why can I do this, but why do I need to do this?
I'm not going to pretend to answer from a corporate perspective, being a nonprofit, but I will say that I would hope that corporate leaders would lean into that complexity and that regulators would lean into that complexity. You know, working in 160 countries, those regulations vary, those rules vary, and we need to simplify these operations so that we can reduce some of that complexity. because we have to lean into it in order to solve the problems that are facing us. We cannot solve the challenges that the world faces if we all stay in our silos and try not to avoid danger and avoid risk. That is not going to get us to a point where some of these big challenges, climate change, refugees, migration, food security, we could go on. We are not going to be able to solve those problems alone. Orvin made this point in his opening comments. No one company, no matter how big they are, is going to be able to address that. It is going to take collective action. And in order for us to achieve collective action, we're going to have to lean into that complexity, resolve it, and be able to work together.
Well, I actually think it's quite simple, because if I'm making decisions solely based on my own data, I will make wrong decisions. So I need this data from third-party sources, including colleagues and competitors in my respective industries, in order to understand the environment in which we are developing our respective activities.
So if I'm a business leader or any NGO, whatever it is, I'm going to start to lose the race, is what you're saying. If I don't get on board, I'm going to actually at risk, my company or my organization's at risk.
Yes, unless you engage and share to a greater extent than what has been the practice in the past.
I would add that in the coming years, if a corporation doesn't exchange or share data with another, will be insulated. And you cannot do business alone. You do business with your business partners, and they will create ecosystem of data sharing. So this is the future, and this data exchange platform will be connected each other to enhance this ability of data sharing. But coming back to another point, we are not to be naive. It's for-profit companies, so they are expecting a reward. And I think there is a possible reward to show that the company is participating to some valuable society issues. This is a reward for corporate companies. It's not direct money. It's a value for the company.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about the truism that we all are living with now, which is that every business is a tech business, increasingly so. So if you're not understanding the tech world, and this is part of it, you're going to increasingly at risk of your business not being able to compete. Is that fair? Yeah.
It's a point.
Yeah.
It's a point.
But from a business perspective, there are so many aspects to this discussion. Take the financing sector. It's very difficult today to raise capital to a business enterprise which is not focusing on sustainability. And so in order to basically develop your business, in order to fund the business, in order to win new opportunities, you need to share the data. And you have to explain not only the current status, but how your performance develop based on transparent and proper and accurate data.
I think there's also a case to be made around the kind of impact that we want to see in the world. And I'll take us back to the COVID-19 pandemic itself. Speaking to Lauren's point around the fact that it's become increasingly clear that for us to be able to come out of situations like these ones, that it's actually going to take collective responsibility. And when you start to think about how we prepare ourselves for the next one, because we know this isn't going to be the last pandemic, and we saw all the different challenges around social protection mechanisms, especially in the global south, right? Is there a case there for this public-private data exchange kind of happening? For example, in the Kenyan context, you have the telco companies being able to share data around financial services. And then you have different NGOs coming together and providing some qualitative information about where people are accessing different kinds of services, and having that feedback to the government and influence the kind of social protection programs that they're building.
Yeah, there are governments in Eastern Europe right now who are trying to manage a refugee crisis, and they don't necessarily have the data that would actually enable them to manage that refugee crisis better, right? It is a piece of the trust. In the end, for all organizations, the trust that you're looking for goes back to the trust of your customer or your client, or right? How do you, can somebody unpick for me a little bit? I guess in a way, I want to know, and obviously you were dealing with phones, I want to know what data you're collecting from me, and then where is it going, and I want to feel like I'm in control of that. How do you ensure that your stakeholders, even if they're individuals, even if, you know, they are living in a village or who knows where, how do you ensure that you maintain that transparency, the word you use?
Perhaps I could go first. It all starts with clear communication and managing expectations. For example, for us, within the Ushahidi context, for anybody who is making use of our platform to collect data from these ordinary people, being very clear about this is the kind of data that we will be collecting from you, and this is the impact of you sharing that data on yourself, and this is what we're going to do with it afterwards. We've also had to be very clear around the mechanisms we've put in place to protect them as well. So one of the first ones is that we've designed our tool to allow for anonymous reporting. And we think about it from the origins of the platform, which was from post-election violence. People will be afraid to share information because you don't want something to be tied back to you. But when you make it possible for me to share something without it being tied directly to myself, it creates an element of safety. And of course, it will create challenge around bias, but there are verification mechanisms that we can put in place. And if you're going to use a tool that can be directly tied to you, for example, SMS, your phone number will be tied to you as an individual, making sure that we do not publish that phone number. It is only accessible to the right people, and even then, we still have different layers of access for anybody who has access to the platform.
And even if, because you're dealing at times with people who don't understand data necessarily.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes. And in those cases, what you have to do again is work with people who already have trust established with them. It could be local community organizations who are able to translate and just clearly communicate what the value of the system will be, and working with them as champions to ensure that we're not putting them at risk.
Yeah, Fabrice.
Yeah, and we have also to be inspired with other industries that are invest on the trust. For instance, the finance industry. Every deal can be checked. Everything can be controlled to see if the deal has been done in a proper way. So doing that, you understand that technology for data exchange is key, because it will be a way for the authorities to check if two companies have done a deal on data, whatever the type of data, personal or non-personal, that is respecting the rules and respecting what has to be done in a proper data transaction.
And Lauren, when it comes to sustainable development and environmental goals and those kinds of issues, there's lots of data that doesn't have these challenges. Right?
There is. There's an enormous amount of publicly available data that could be utilized effectively to help us, identify solutions and know whether or not we're making progress and give us insights and all of those types of things. I think I'd add one comment to Angela and Fabrice's contributions in terms of, how do you manage user expectations? I think one of the things that we have found with data over many, many years is people are far more willing to engage and share data when that data comes back to them in terms of useful information. And so if I'm reporting something, then, and I know that that is going to then evoke a response, whether that be in terms of a protection of my security in my community, or we've seen this a lot with NGOs who are required to report to their donors. But if that information doesn't come back to them in terms of, oh, here's something for greater understanding, then it becomes a chore as opposed to an opportunity for greater impact. And so I think that's one of the things that we really have to balance in terms of thinking about how are we transparent with the subjects and the folks that are sharing data with us, but how are we also returning value to make sure that there is benefit from the act of sharing.
Yeah, if you compare, we are very stressed on the personal data because it touched our life.
Right.
So we are stressed on that. When you talk about industrial data, it's the same thing for corporation. So they have the same stress, basically. So we can say we want to protect personal data, and for corporate data, we don't care. So we have to provide also a channel for them, or ways for them to have this kind of level of control that we want for personal data too.
Which is what you're trying to offer in your business. Right. Ovind, have you already been able to show your shareholders that they are profiting from what you're trying to do?
Well, it's hard to measure. but trust is also important for shareholder value. And transparency and willingness to share data and discuss also the dilemmas openly is, in my experience, a prerequisite for trust, also with shareholders in 2022.
So it feels like there are still significant headwinds, but you also are seeing successes. Talk a bit about the successes that you're seeing. Do you think that, if you like, the received wisdom when it comes to data sharing is shifting, or where are you still finding that there are real hurdles? Lauren.
Gosh, that's a loaded question. You know, are there places where we're seeing success? Yes. And I think, you know, in the world in which I work, you know, we are seeing organizations that 4 or 5 years ago would have said, yes, we ought to be sharing data, but would not have actually been sharing data. Now really sitting around the table, rolling up their sleeves and saying, okay, we are trying to serve populations in crisis. In order to serve populations in crisis well, we have to know these things. And you know this, and I know this, and we can figure out this. If we put all of that together, we will each be able to serve our niche population much better. I haven't seen really that kind of, you know, rolling up of the sleeves and getting down to do the hard work in such enormous or in momentous ways as I have over the last, you know, 12 to 18 months. There are still headwinds. It is still difficult. The complexity of personally identifiable information is one that we're going to have to solve. But there is much more willingness, I think, especially in discrete scenarios or discrete applications, for us to try and solve those problems so that we can get that good impact we're looking for.
I think one other complexity, well, maybe I should call it an opportunity, is this idea of interoperability. And let me try and make that, you know, talk about it in simpler terms. You have a data set that is in one format, and I have another one that's in a different format. So both of us are willing to share, and that's amazing. But it's going to take so much more time to take your data set and make it speak to mine so we're able to then draw out the insights. There aren't that many platforms out there that are enabling that kind of interoperability. Yes, we have platforms like the Humanitarian Data Exchange that's led by UN OCHA's data team that makes it easy for different organizations to share data, and they standardize it, and so somebody else will be able to come and take it over. But we need more of those.
Does that make sense, Fabrice? That's kind of partly what you're trying to address, isn't it?
I really think that the market is going in the right way. We supply our technology to many organizations, for instance, in the agricultural sectors, in the space industry. So the market is going in that way. Institutions are going also in that way. When you look at what the European Commission is doing, when you look at associations like Gaia X in Europe and in other parts of the world. So I think definitely it's going in this way. It could be sometimes seen as a bit slow, but we are on the track.
Finish off for us. Paint a happy future, a future of where everyone's data connects with each other and no one worries and no one's privacy is ever risked, and everyone. Humanity is better and everyone makes more money.
Thank you for the trust. But quite frankly, I think the challenges facing us are also the opportunity. Because in order to not only resolve the challenges, but turn it into business opportunity and create a market demand for solutions which will make the world more sustainable going forward. We have all a strong, not only obligation, but self-interest in what we have been discussing today. Sharing data, take control over the information flow, and make sure that decisions are made both by businesses, individuals, and by governments, based on safeguarded, accurate facts and figures.
Terrific. Thank you very much to my panel. I hope you guys learned something. I certainly did. Great conversation. Thank you.